It's my honor to introduce to you Charisse Bach. Charisse Bach lives in Oregon on the traditional lands of the Kalapuya, which are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. Cherice is a recorded minister in Sierra Cascade Yearly Meeting of Friends, where she just concluded a term as the inaugural co-clerk of that yearly meeting. She's a member of North Valley Friends Church in Newberg, Oregon, where she lives with her 2 kids, her spouse, an Australian shepherd, and numerous chickens. Cherice edits the Barclay Press Illuminate Bible Study curriculum. For a number of years, Cherice has been an adjunct professor of Theology at Portland Seminary and also teaches at George Fox University in Newberg, Oregon. She currently leads Oregon Interfaith Power and Light in her role as the Creation Justice Advocate at the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. Cherice's scholarship and passion focuses on creation care and eco-theology. I first came to know her as the online curator of the Watershed Discipleship Network. Her recent work includes Quakers, Creation Care, and Sustainability, a volume that she co-edited and it was published in 2019. Other publications include Climatologists, Theologians, and Climate Change Toward an Eco-Theology of Critical Hope, which was published in the magazine Cross Currents in 2016. Cherice travels under the care of her church and her yearly meeting. She's accompanied by letters of travel, and I would like to read some excerpts from them here for you. Dear friends, loving greetings from friends at North Valley Friends Church in Newberg, Oregon. Charisse Bach, a recognized minister and member in good standing of North Valley Friends, carries a concern to travel among you and minister to God's calling for creation care. Cherice has been part of our community for many years and has ministered among friends throughout the United States. She's deeply grounded in her knowledge about Quaker history and passionate about understanding creation care through biblical calling, theological understanding, and our history as Christians and Quakers, as well as acting on creation care through practical measures. We find Cherice's leading to travel rightly ordered and commend her to your loving care. We look forward to hearing about your experience with Cherice and how the Spirit is at work among you. We pray your time together will go well and the Spirit will be moving and teaching. In the light of Christ, Tricia Hornbach and Dwight Burton, co-clerks. And then a greeting from Sierra Cascade's yearly meeting of friends. It's addressed, Dear friends in New England yearly meeting, we greet you with joy. We celebrate the many relationships that knit our communities together across the distance. Thank you for inviting Charisse Bach to present Bible half hours during your annual sessions. We've asked Cherice to represent Sierra Cascade yearly meeting of friends as she ministers to you. We know Cherice as a wise teacher and a passionate advocate for justice. She is recognized as a leader among us, a recorded minister, and the inaugural co-clerk of our yearly meeting. We happily bear witness to the call God has given her for public ministry. Dove John will accompany Cherice as a traveling elder. Dove is also an official representative of Sierra Cascade's yearly meeting of friends, visiting on our behalf. Dove currently serves on our Equity and Inclusion Committee and represents Sierra Cascade's yearly meeting of friends to North Pacific yearly meeting. Dove is involved in the work of Friends Committee on National Legislation and the American Friends Service Committee. We recommend Charisse and Dove to you without reservation. Thank you for the fellowship and care you will extend to them. May their ministry with you nurture the seeds of light within you. Love, Mike Huber, co-clerk, Sierra Cascades Yearly Meeting. During this week of our yearly meeting sessions, Cherice will bring to us a Quaker Theology, Meditations on the Future of Friends. This is a reminder that when Cherice is done, we will settle into worship for about half an hour. I'd like to welcome Charisse Bach.
Thank you, Christina. And it's good to be with you all. Good morning. At least it's morning over here on the West Coast. Good noon, I guess, to all of you over there on the East Coast. It's wonderful to be with you. I wish that we could be in person, of course, and I'm really grieving all those lost in-between moments where we'd grab a cup of coffee or a meal together or stay up way too late chatting. And so I hope someday that I can be with you in person, but I'm really grateful to at least share this time together virtually. It's kind of funny because the original plan was for you all to invite me into your meeting space, but actually now I'm inviting you into mine. So this behind me is, you can see North Valley Friends. It's not just a Zoom background, but this is my actual meeting space. So welcome to North Valley Friends, all of you. It's good to worship with you here. I send my deep gratitude to the wonderful folks who have served as my elders and who are holding us in the light today. From New England Yearly Meeting, Mary Hopkins and Jean Rosenberg, and from Sierra Cascades Yearly Meeting of Friends, Dove John. You will see them throughout the week at the end of worship, closing the meeting with a digital handshake. It feels like a lot is going on in the world right now, doesn't it? This is possibly the strangest, most disappointing, and in some ways most exciting year of my life thus far. I don't know about you, but I'm experiencing pain and fear over the pandemic and its various impacts. I experience anger and grief about the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others who've lost their lives due to police brutality. And I'm experiencing incredible hope and joy and energy in the movements for Black lives and the protests, particularly of late the ones over here near me in the other Portland. It's been eye-opening and invigorating to try to figure out how to be part of this movement in true solidarity. More on that later in the week. A month or so ago, I was a little bit worried about giving these talks to you because there's so much going on in the world and it all feels so heavy. For a while this spring, it felt like we were all sprinting to get through the pandemic and the shutdowns and the early protests. So I felt like, how can I speak into that exhaustion? In the last couple of weeks, although nothing has really improved, I feel our country shifting into more of a marathon mode. So hopefully that's accurate for how you're feeling as well. And I feel like we're at a point where we recognize we have gone far enough that we can't go back, and a shift needs to happen. In some ways, this is a scary moment because we could tip into a really horrific phase, and that there's that real danger. But there's also the real opportunity for positive change, and that's what I want us to focus on together this week. So I titled these Bible half hours, A Quaker Ecology, Meditations on the Future of Friends. And I promise I'll get to the Bible part eventually of these Bible half hours, but today's talk is going to be in 4 parts. So the first part is a few queries I want us to start off with about what it means to be Quaker. The second part is about myself and my story. You might be asking, who is this person that's talking to us? So I'll give you a little bit of background. The third part will be about the Bible and exploring a passage together today. And the fourth part, I will introduce the concept of an Eco Reformation as a way for us to think about how we're moving in this moment. So first, a query. Why are you a Quaker? Why did you become a Quaker? And what makes you continue to want to be one? Reflect on that for a moment. And most of you don't know me well yet, but Quakerism is a deep part of my heritage and identity. And yet, behind my question is a deeper question. Does Quakerism need to continue? I don't ask this question to make you defensive. I want to ask us this question: does Quakerism need to continue, in all honesty and out of reflection about ourselves in this stage in our history? If the answer is yes, then what is our particular work? What is our work in this moment of transition I just mentioned? I speak this query as a love letter to my broad Quaker family. I also speak this to you all in New England Yearly Meeting, because from what I know of you, you're about as close to what I would hope Quakers would be doing as any body of friends. And so I have a reasonable hope that you can take what I have to say as a challenge to keep doing the work you're doing and intensify it. I was encouraged to hear and read about Lisa Graustein's plenary last year and the minutes she referred to regarding New England Yearly Meeting's repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, statements against racism and other injustices, and New England's Yearly Meeting to commit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 10% each of the last 2 years. You're engaging in hard conversations, making changes, sticking together as a community, and actively standing up for justice. In short, I'm a little bit smitten with your yearly meeting. You all give me hope that Friends may have a future that's spirit-led and exciting. And if I didn't already love you all, seeing you dancing and moving to the music of Imagine yesterday during the plenary brought you right into my heart. Does Quakerism need to continue? The catalyst for our denomination's beginning was George Fox's experience of Christ personally and immediately, and he found others who had a similar experience. I wrote this before Dr. Amanda Kemp spoke yesterday, and I wonder if the reason we often go back to this story of our beginning point is because it was a moment before any trauma in our denomination. It was a moment where we can each feel and resonate with his breaking open to be the unfathomable being he could be, as Amanda put it. So from this moment when he was broken open and connected to the unity of the divine light, a movement emerged. The early Friends made the polite company of their day uncomfortable, and they themselves experienced great discomfort. Jail time, beatings, persecution in a multitude of forms. They were not perfect by any means, and I'm not saying we should emulate them in all things. But why were they willing to experience such discomfort and persecution? Because they experienced the Spirit so intensely, and they created a community bound together in such love and support that they felt the courage to enact the kingdom of God to the best of their understanding. What about us? Will we have that kind of courage, and will we be that kind of community for each other? Can this happen within the bounds of what we know as Quakerism? Or do we need to break open so much that it will feel like starting over? Can you feel how this moment in history is pregnant with the intensity of the spiritual power that we look back on in the lives of that first generation of Friends? Take a moment and tap into that spiritual power wherever you are. Can you feel it? Across the miles, I'm hopeful that we are experiencing the same presence, the light and love who gathers us all as in a net into a spiritual community ready for radical and spirit-filled action. I hope and pray that we are a generation who can listen and respond, who can participate in the renewal of creation that the community of all life so desperately needs right now. And so this week, with hopefully equal parts humility and conviction, I offer you this series of Bible half hours. Amanda brought up the proverb yesterday, without vision, the people perish. And I'm offering to you, with open hands, my piece of the puzzle as we discern together about the future of our small but mighty denomination. My main point this week is for friends in the United States to continue into the future faithfully, particularly those of us of European descent. And in order to do so, I think we need to go through an Eco Reformation, an expansion and a breaking open of our vision, a new imaginative landscape in which we can move and grow and hope and transform. The Eco Reformation I'm talking about means we need to radically reorient our collective life ways from individual control toward collaboration and participation in the community of all life. I'll say that again. We need to radically reorient our collective life ways from individual control toward collaboration and participation in the community of all life. This transformative work intersects with our social and political relationships, our economies, and our spiritual lives, as well as our ecological relationships. I think this also fits with what Noah shared on Saturday, using the terms revealing, surrendering, and turning. We didn't talk to each other about what we were going to say, but I think we're all talking to the same spirit. The work of rowing on, which you've committed to through your theme this week, is the continued work of recognizing and repenting from the past. That is, letting the Spirit reveal to us the truth of our past and present, surrendering our fears and our comfortable habits, and opening ourselves to the great turning, the upwelling of spiritual power I asked us to tap into a few moments ago. This is the work of the Eco Reformation. As a way into understanding what I'm talking about with an Eco Reformation, as well as to let you know more about myself, I'm going to share a bit of my own story about coming to Quakerism and of waking up to the reality of climate justice as the most pressing social justice issue of our time. I think this will help explain the context of my question about whether Quakerism needs to continue, as well as the intersecting nature of climate justice, racial justice, natural resource use, violent conflict, and the beginnings of my own shift in worldview toward an eco-reformation. I was born into a Quaker family in Oregon, part of Northwest Yearly Meeting, and I grew up worshiping in an unprogrammed meeting started by my friends and my parents and some of their friends right around the time when I was born. We began attending a program friends meeting when I was about 11 because my parents thought it would be good to be in a congregation that had a bigger youth group. And my dad was an important person in my faith journey growing up. And as a kid, I remember talking with him about the big questions of life and faith and spending time hiking, looking at the stars, and engaging in other actions of awe and wonder at the beauty and immensity of this spectacular world. When I was 12, my dad let me know one day that he no longer believed in God. So, in my early teen years, I questioned everything about my faith. In asking these questions, however, I felt with depth and intensity the presence of an intimately personal spirit, the epitome of love and care, who was a constant presence, accompanying me through my questions and doubts. I questioned whether Jesus was the Son of God and whether the Bible was true and or useful. I felt a deep resonance with the person of Jesus and his way of radical care. And although there are definitely parts of the Bible that are troubling and context-bound, the Bible connects us to a long history of the people of faith struggling to find meaning, to live faithfully, and to describe and document across time the community's mystical and messy relationship to the living spirit of love. And I questioned whether Quakerism was the right denomination for me. And by this time, I was in high school and I was discovering Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Fry and John Woolman. And I saw in their words and their work the heart of the gospel message. Good news that enacts liberation alongside those most oppressed and marginalized. I also experienced the inward light of Christ encountered by earlier friends when I participated in worship and in service, in play and in business meetings and in youth group. Quakers are my people, and I became a convinced friend. Since that time, I've worshiped with both programmed and unprogrammed friends around Oregon and sojourned with Princeton Monthly meeting out in New Jersey and South Mountain Friends, and then program meeting in Southern Oregon. And while friends are still my people, I've also experienced a painful break in my trust in the Quaker process when my yearly meeting removed several meetings over their acknowledgement of queer marriage and ministry. The beautiful vulnerability of seeking the leading of the Spirit together was not honored. And the structures of Quaker process meant that those of us removed from Northwest Yearly Meeting lost much of what we had built together. We created a new yearly meeting that is wonderful, though still hurting, but something beautiful was lost, and the hope and trust of many friends was broken. So that is my story as a friend, and part of what underlies my question about whether Quakerism should continue. Although Quakers are my people, I've seen my people deeply wound one another, not only in my own yearly meeting, but also across other parts of our Quaker family. I've seen how Quaker process can be used as a weapon to control and to exclude. Are our traditional ways of being Quaker worth renewing, or are they too much a product of European American white supremacy, colonialism, and the ideology of power over that comes with this worldview? That's a question I think we need to take seriously. And I'm grateful to hear about your Noticing Patterns of Oppression and Faithfulness working group. That sounds like an attempt to address that systemic problem. At the same time, I've been listening about what I am particularly called to work on and what we as friends need to be focusing on in our time. I was inspired by earlier generations of friends, and I want to be part of my own generation's faithfulness. As part of my discernment, I went on a delegation with Christian peacemaker teams to Israel, Palestine in 2008. While I knew a good deal about the conflict there, seeing it with my own eyes brought it home in powerful ways. One particular evening, I was up late standing on the rooftop terrace of a Palestinian home in Dheisheh refugee camp outside Bethlehem. I could see an Israeli settlement, Har Omah, all lit up in its suburban glory on the next hill. I felt angry that Israeli settlers had taken more land from Palestinians, and I was flooded with all the stories we'd heard on the trip: stolen land, intimidated and murdered family members, destruction of olive trees, blockades of water access routes, use of military force against civilians deemed terrorists for throwing stones, and petty acts of dehumanization against Palestinians by using their water catch tanks for target practice. I felt righteously angry, and I felt I was on the right side of history, looking down my nose at those who were treating others so unjustly. And then I realized that in my own country, it's me in the settlement. Although we're a couple hundred years farther down the road here in our settling of this land in Oregon, and more than that in New England, and we've created laws so that our occupation of this land is mostly legal, the situation is the same. My people, European Americans, have claimed all the best land and access to natural resources, and dehumanized the native peoples of these lands in countless ways. Although friends point to William Penn's purchase of a section of Pennsylvania, most of us do not live on that fairly purchased land. My Quaker ancestors were some of the first to settle new lands as they moved west with the frontier, but more on that later in the week. What I was experiencing on that terrace in Palestine was awareness of my complicity in colonialism, a recognition of the interconnectedness between colonialism, natural resource exploitation, dehumanizing oppression and injustice, and war. If I'm honest, I went there with a not well-examined desire to be a white savior, to help bring peace in someone else's conflict. This is not to speak ill of Christian peacemaker teams, and I definitely support their work. But this is to confess my own complicity in white supremacy and settler colonialist mindsets. That night, I realized I was called to stay home and work on the conflicts and issues in my own place and with my own people. It is my people, European Americans, who others are emulating around the world in land grabs against indigenous populations. It's my people who are exporting economic and military control over natural resources and supply chains all over the globe. This was a pivotal moment for me when I began to become aware of the impact of white supremacy and colonialism on my worldview and on my faith. So I, like many of you, started being able to see the ways that my life and faith were shaped by my experience as a descendant of colonists and as a citizen of a militarized empire whose main goal is the control of populations and natural resources, even though I grew up Quaker. This is a moment of revealing, to use the language that Noah introduced on Saturday. I had known about all of this before in my head, but now I felt it. I knew it to be deeply true about myself. There's an interesting healing story in Mark 8:22 through 25 that feels like an analogy to my experience. So we're going to spend a few moments with that passage as today's biblical focus. This passage comes directly before Mark shows Jesus posing the question, who do you say that I am, to his disciples? This is an important section because it stands at the very heart of Mark's gospel, between two chunks of teaching and miracle stories. Directly leading up to the climax, the profession of Jesus' Christhood and his explanation of what that means, Mark places this story from Mark 8:22 through 25. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village, and when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly, both near and far. Nowhere else in the whole Bible do we see Jesus have to touch a person twice in order for them to be healed. At first glance, it seems like a story where Jesus fails, but that misses the point. Mark isn't showing Jesus as an incompetent healer, but he's showing the followers of Jesus their inability to see clearly. The story of the healing of this man was likely a story Mark inherited from oral tradition, but he places it at this point in his gospel for a very specific reason. It serves as a metaphor about what needs to happen to the disciples. This becomes clear when we look at the stories right around this miracle. The story right before this shows the disciples not really seeing what Jesus means when he tells them to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. They think he's getting on their case for forgetting to bring bread. He asks them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember?" Then, right after the passage about the healing of the man who is blind, Jesus asks them who others and who they themselves think Jesus is. They say they think he's the Christ, but they don't really see him for who he is. They recognize Jesus as an important guy, probably even unparalleled among prophets. They've left everything and followed him. They think he's the Messiah, the one they've been waiting for. But even though the disciples understand all of this, they aren't really seeing fully what and who Jesus is. Like the man who'd been blind, they're still seeing people looking like trees walking around. Jesus explains to them what it means that he is the Christ in Mark 8:31. He's the Son of humanity who must suffer and die. Even though Jesus explains this repeatedly, the disciples still expect the Christ to be a triumphant military leader who will wipe out the Romans and reestablish the throne of Israel. They expect this even up to Jesus' arrest and death. they're still seeing like the man at the first touch of Jesus, seeing people looking like trees walking around. They see more clearly than they have ever seen before, but they are still expecting Jesus to establish a political empire. In the story of the healing of this man, there are several things that might help us see how this metaphor applies to us. First, Jesus takes him by the hand and leads him outside the village. This may have been unknown territory for him, who gets around by feel and spatial memory, which is easier within a town than it is out in the open. Jesus takes the man someplace where he's uncomfortable, but he's leading him by the hand. Jesus touches his eyes, then asks, "Can you see anything?" The man can see, but not clearly. If I had been in this situation, I can imagine myself being ecstatic, then I can actually see something. I might be tempted to jump up and say, "Thank you," and yes, of course I can see something, and run off, assuming that people are supposed to look that way. But this man listens to Jesus' question, tells him what he sees, and waits while Jesus touches him again. Then his eyes are fully restored and he can see clearly. I recognize myself in the experience of this man, and I also see this as a metaphor for us as a community of friends. Perhaps we've experienced partial spiritual healing, but I suggest we are in need of a second healing touch. What I experienced in Palestine was something like that second touch of Jesus, where I realized that although I had been seeing some things, I had not been seeing clearly. Jesus took him outside the village to a place where he was uncomfortable, just like my experience. I think we can also have these kinds of experiences without having to go to a foreign country, though. We can sit with an idea or perspective that we haven't encountered before, and we can allow ourselves to be opened up, for our vision to be clarified and expanded. Regardless of who you think Jesus was, he was encouraging his disciples to see him more clearly, and that meant they knew he was going to suffer and die. To be his disciple meant following him in that path that leads us out of our comfort zones into something life-altering. Here we are back together. Also, while it can feel convicting and possibly shaming to recognize the ways our actions have not been rightly focused in the past, using this passage as a metaphor hopefully opens us up to our need for healing. A clarifying of our vision rather than something shameful to try to conceal. And so this brings us to a more complete description of the Eco Reformation. We're like the man in the story. We as friends have gotten a lot of things right, but we're not seeing clearly as we could. We still have more work to do. What I'm proposing as an Eco Reformation is a reorientation of the worldview that expands and clarifies what we already know to be true as friends, but we're going to need a second healing touch in order to get there. While individual choices to purchase more sustainable items and reduce our emissions are a necessary part of the work that needs to be done, they are nowhere near sufficient to get us to where we need to be to leave a more livable planet to future generations. For the Quaker denomination to continue faithfully into the 21st century, we need to accept this second healing touch, which will mean a radical reorientation of most of our spiritual, social, and economic lives. Are we up for it? I'm going to assume we want to be. So what would this Eco-Reformation look like? It's this question that we'll be exploring together in the next several days. I'll conclude this talk with a few definitions that will help set the stage for that work. So first, what do I mean by an Eco-Reformation? Historian Philip Watson described the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s as a Copernican revolution in religion. People's whole worldview shifted as dramatically as it did when scientists realized we orbit the sun rather than the sun orbiting us. In the Protestant Reformation, we shifted our cultural understanding of responsibility for our faith from a transaction with a priest to a relationship between ourselves and God, a priesthood of all believers. And of course, Friends took that even further. In an Eco-Reformation, another shift in worldview is necessary. From the book Eco Reformation, the shift is described thus: to address the eco-crises we face, we also need to conceive anew what it means to be human. We've imagined ourselves living on the earth rather than embedded in it and thoroughly dependent on it. We've focused on the well-being of humans to the neglect of the well-being of all living things. In this moment, we're seeing the effects of the Reformation's imperfect vision of an individualized religion and the parallel societal impacts of the Enlightenment and modernism, which have centered human beings as subjects while all other parts of creation are objects. And of course, certain human beings are seen as more reliable subjects in our culture that has centered the white, male, cisgender, heterosexual European American experience as normative. The shift in worldview required by an Eco Reformation can be visualized in this helpful graphic that shows the difference between an ego and an eco perspective. The ego perspective is based on the Western worldview, where there's a hierarchy, a great chain of being that extends from God to male human beings, to other human beings in a rigid hierarchy, to animals that are similar to humans, to other animals, to plants, and so forth. In this schema, the land is seen as a set of commodities, as objects to be used for the sake of human beings, important for their utility to us and able to be quantified by their market value. In the eco perspective, humanity is part of the whole. Rather than hierarchical, this model is relational. Each individual and species and landscape element holds a unique and vital place in a web of relations. This web breaks down the illusion of hierarchy. Human beings cannot exist without the plants and animals that nourish them, without the land that tethers them in place. Without the global community, we cannot live on this planet. Part of the necessary shift is learning to see and interpret our history, our sacred text, and our own lives through the lens of this Eco Reformation. To do this week we will be learning to see biblical texts using ecological hermeneutics as well as decolonizing hermeneutics. So this is where we need some other definitions. Hermeneutics is just a fancy word for interpretation. Interpreting the Bible through an ecological and decolonizing lens means that we read it with awareness of the current ecological crises and the compounding of racial and other injustices, and we attend to ways in which the biblical text breaks down the ideas of colonialism, empire building, and the impulses of control and domination. An ecological and decolonizing hermeneutic emerges, and we start paying attention to the way the land and other creatures are part of the story. We see the heart of the biblical witness pointing toward a participatory community of all life. Today, I pointed out in regards to the passage from Mark that Jesus' disciples expected him to build an empire, but he was not about building empires. So this is an example of using a decolonizing hermeneutic to open up the biblical text to help us to really see the work of the Eco Reformation. As a human species, and particularly as individuals from the United States, we have the choice before us to live into an ecological worldview or to continue to operate under an egoic worldview until we exhaust all the planet's gifts. This is a very real and stark choice for us all, Quaker or not. And so I return us to the question I posed earlier, and you can use these as queries for our time of waiting worship. Does Quakerism need to continue? If so, what would a faithful friends community look like in this century?